That's enough. All right. Thank you so much. Let's move through this presentation. So the evolution of ransomware from floppies to droppers. This was my clever pun. Today we're going to talk about some stories. This is story time with Grandpa. About all the way from the first one, or how they evolved, and what has changed, and maybe we can learn something along the way. So, first thing is a question. Stay on your feet. When was the first ransomware? If anybody knows, you can scream the answer. 89. Yes. 1989 was the first ransomware, and it's a little bit strange because we are all thinking about ransomware nowadays. And I think there's some people in the audience that weren't born before 1989. So to know that the first ransomware is older than you, or maybe some of your children, is probably kind of a weird thing to realize. But the first one was 1989, but actually all of these dates are kind of like little Easter eggs in the history of ransomware. But this was the first ransomware, the AIDS Trojan, or in its other different name is the AIDS Information Software. And this was the brilliant idea of a guy called Joseph L. Pope. And Joseph L. Pope had this amazing thought. He was kind of working on computers, and he thought, well, if I can write this virus that locks people's computers, and then I could send this virus to them, and I can make them open it, and lock their computers, and then I can ask them to pay. Maybe I can make a ton of money. Like there's somewhere a question mark in between, and then profit. So he figured it out. He thought, this is going to be a brilliant idea, and he actually did it. So Joseph L. Pope decided one day he was going to buy a ton of floppy disks, and he was going to put all the floppy disks in envelopes, and he's going to lick the envelope, put them in the mail, and send them to a whole bunch of people. And then if they put this floppy disk in their computer, there's going to be the virus politely asks them to turn on their printer, because we're fancy, and it would print out a ransom note, because it's kind of the old days. And on the ransom note, it would say, please send $378 to a P.O. box in Panama. Genius. 2 birds in 1 stone. He collects the money in Panama, and he can go on vacation, which is great. And I thought about this for a while. I like this story. It's a very interesting story, but also I thought about this. It's kind of, there's 3 parts to this scam. And I thought it was interesting that all of these 3 parts actually kind of are relevant for modern ransomware. So I want to analyze the evolution of ransomware in the context of these 3 parts of what he did. So let's talk about what he actually did. When they caught him, spoiler alert, when they caught him, they found 10,000 floppy disks in his parents' house. And which is crazy. So the delivery method that this man chose, and this is 1989, was to take floppy disks and send them by mail. This is probably the most difficult way to spread malware in existence. But he was determined, and he was able to do that, and he was able to send all this. And you have to ask yourself, how did this guy get all the addresses of the people that he wanted to send it to? Well, I think already we can find the first example of the connection between this old ransomware to the modern ransomware of today. Because this was called the AIDS Trojan. And the fact that he relied on this very important virus at the time in the 80s was a form of social engineering, right? Because we see this today, right? Recently there was a big virus, I don't know if you guys have heard, past 3 or 4 years. It was COVID, and there was a lot of different social engineering scams that used this to trick people into opening different scams, different phishing, different attacks. So Joseph L. Pope, 30, 40 years ago, figured, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this the AIDS Trojan, the AIDS Information Software, and I'm going to send this to AIDS researchers. So there would be these business magazines where there would be lists of people, addresses, and he decided he's going to send this to AIDS researchers, which is pretty mean if you think about it. Like, these are people trying to save the world from an epidemic, and this guy is a jerk. And so that was his sort of method of doing that. And I think it's interesting. Social engineering has probably existed long before the internet, but it's always good to remember that. The encryption that he used, I mean, today we know that encryption is pretty complicated, but he used very simple encryption. It was symmetric encryption. I'm not an expert in encryption, but it was very simple substitution cipher. You just kind of change the order of the letters, or you kind of move the letter up the alphabet in some direction, and basically you change up the letters. That was pretty much what he did. And it was very simple to unencrypt it. It was very simple to treat it, but it's 1989. What are you going to do? Like, send a letter to your local InfoSec expert? Like, there's nothing you could do about it, which was, again, he was a big jerk. But, the interesting thing was, and I think this was, again, a sad thing, is that there were a lot of researchers that lost a lot of their work because when their computer froze up, what do you do when you don't know what your computer is doing right now? Shut it down, you turn it back on, you try to format, so there were a number of cases where people lost years of AIDS research. And actually, some of these details are the details that are going to bring to his demise, this man. And finally, the business model, my favorite part of this scam, sending cash to a PO box in Panama, is so brilliant that it was stupid. And a PO box, when you open a PO box, you have to put your name on there. And, that was the first thing that kind of got the authorities onto him. So they figured out there was a man, whose name is Joseph L. Pope. They figured out this guy is causing AIDS researchers to lose their research, and they decided to do something about it. And of course, they didn't catch him for a long time because nobody cared about computer crime back then. But when they did catch him, they caught him in Amsterdam, and he was just kind of wandering around there. Caught him at the airport, and they brought him to the judge, and it actually turned out the guy was a little bit crazy. And he would put like curlers in his beard, and he would wear like weird hats. And the judge was like, well, poor guy, this is the like craziest thing I've ever heard with the floppy disk. It was 1989. Nobody cared. So they let him go. Right? So 40 years ago, nobody cared about ransomware. Today, we would probably destroy this man's life. But I think this is an interesting way to look at the evolution, because we have these three things. So let's try to focus on each one of those things. I told you there's going to be stories. That was the first one. Okay, so I want to talk about the encryption. How has encryption evolved? Joseph L. Pope, this first ransomware ever created, was very, very simple. It's one of the most basic types of encryption you can create. You just kind of change around the letters. Bada bing, bada boom. That's not what's going on in ransomware today, if you're wondering. But I want to do a little detour because I like history and I like stories. And before we go all the way, I think the history of the encryption in ransomware is fairly straightforward. So I'll take you on a different journey. And in 2010, there was this trend of screen lockers, because cyber criminals figured out what's easier than encrypting a malware, not encrypting a malware, and telling the victim that they're locked. So what would happen is something like this. You would get a message from the FBI and the CIA and the Department of Homeland Security, and they would tell you that you committed a terrible crime and you're going to go to jail for many years unless you give us $20. If you pay $20, it's all good, it's whatever. So they did that, And that was kind of, I thought was kind of interesting. I mean, it's just kind of a very pure form of social engineering, you know. But the interesting thing is it did work in some cases. And there's even a story of somebody who turned himself in to the FBI. There was a 20-year-old man in America who turned himself in because they thought that they were onto him, and I think he had some bad files on his computer. And so he went to the office, and they were like, "What the hell are you talking about?" And he's like, "I brought the $20." Anyway, but he was locked up, and that's the story of screen lockers. I thought that was pretty interesting. This just a little bit of a detour that I wanted to include here. But really, the story of encryption, like I said, I think it's pretty straightforward, because encryption, even in the days of Joseph L. Pope, we knew about better types of encryption, right? These three men, Rivest, Shamir, and Edelman, RSA, they created the mathematical algorithm of asymmetrical encryption. Again, I'm not an expert. Kill me later if I'm saying anything wrong. But they created this mathematical algorithm of how to encrypt something in an asymmetric way so that you can lock something up, and then you can have a different key to open it up. So if you're, for example, writing a malware, you can have the locking mechanism on the malware, but you can have the unlocking mechanism with you, so then you can send it to somebody to open it up, basically. So that it existed, it was just a question of how to transfer it to the world of computers or how to put it on a software. And it took a while for it to actually come in to the world of computers. But this is interesting because in 1996, and by the way, the RSA algorithm was somewhere in the 70s. But in 1996, this paper was written. And it's just, I love how, like, these are academics, you know, and they're thinking of all these different terms, and they're like write these papers, and basically all they're doing is like, well, what if you could encrypt the software and then you have to pay something? So that's what they did. They invented ransomware technically in an academic paper, and all they did was they said, well, what if I could, lock your computer with some kind of malware, somehow I get it to your machine, and for you to open it, you will have to pay me some kind of e-currency, because they didn't know about Bitcoin. They thought e-currency would be some kind of money in the future. It was the 90s, it was cyberpunk, you know, everybody thought the future would be cool. Nobody predicted the existence of Dogecoin. But, you know, they were like, e-money, and then we're so brilliant, we've discovered ransomware. But they did, actually. And it would take another 10 years for actual encrypting ransomware to show up on the scene. And this is the first RSA encrypted ransomware that I could find. And I read a lot, but that's the first one I could find. GPCode in 2006. You would get a resume or something, some kind of job application, and if you open the file, then you would get encrypted. And, you know, in the beginning, there was a lot of effort, like collective effort, to try and break these algorithms, because if you use a low enough sort of bit rate for the encryption, again, I'm not an expert, shoot me later, you know, with enough processing power back in the day, you could actually get over it. But then, as I kind of researched this, I would see sort of the desperation growing. So people would kind of collectively put their computers together to try and break the encryption, until the encryption got more and more complicated, and they just couldn't. Like, there was no amount of computers in the world that could unencrypt, which was kind of a sad moment. And you can still find these like forum posts and all these announcements like, oh, please, let's get all of our computing power together so we can stop this threat. And at some point, it got just too complicated. And I think this is an interesting fact, because I think still today, I think we're in a situation where encryption is very, very complicated and not very easy to decrypt. And it's not like there's no cases ever of decryption of malware, right? Sometimes it does happen. Law enforcement sometimes works, sometimes, rarely. Or in the case of Babuk, for example, that was a ransomware where allegedly the person who created it got terminal cancer, and they wanted to. I don't know if it's true or not. We'll take it seriously. We wanted to die a better person, and they released the source code. And when they released the source code, you could probably go in and try to decrypt it. So it happens, but I don't think it happens well enough. And so when I think about this evolution of encryption, when I think of all the evolution, I try to think about where are we today and what's going to happen in the future. And again, not an expert, but I don't think that the whole part of encryption is going to be solved anytime soon. So it's almost like I think about it like picking a lock. You know, you have these 3 tumblers that we're talking about, and for attackers, I think at least the encryption one is kind of set in a pretty good place. I don't think that's where we're going to succeed, but maybe I'm wrong. The only other thing with encryption was that attackers are now exfiltrating the data, and they're doing a lot more than that. You know, everybody's inventing new types of extortion every day. There's double extortion, triple extortion, quadruple sold. You know, it's like, okay, but the exfiltration is pretty serious. So you can lock the files, you can also steal the data. And that's not the type of encryption, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So we're all the way caught up on the history of encryption. So, the next thing. The business model. I wanted to touch a little bit on the business model. It is full of bad ideas. Starting with the worst idea in the world, the Panama money scam. But there's been a lot of different ways. How do attackers monetize, like throughout history? How do you get paid when you create these scams? I think that is a very important part of the history of ransomware, because without this part, I don't think ransomware would exist. This is a super, super important part. And in the past, there were all these really crazy ideas. Starting with gift cards and prepaid debit cards, this is something that still happens, I think, you know, these types of scams. This one is interesting. The FBI one would actually open your webcam and freak the shit out of you. I would probably get scared. But the debit card is such a silly idea. I mean, what are you going to do? Send them like $25 on it's so stupid. You can't really collect a lot of money. Like imagine trying to ransom a company. Well, don't imagine. Do good stuff. But if you were to imagine trying to get like $100,000 in ransom with debit cards. There's no way. But then we got the e-currency, the electronic currency, which is also a stupid idea because these were traceable. And so these led to the capture of a lot of these or not a lot, but led to the capture of criminals. This wasn't a good idea either. And it was a little bit complicated. So they were still brainstorming, you know. Another interesting one was the premium phone calls, SMS. You kind of have to send a message to some phone number and it pays the attacker. You get your code. Kind of similar to, and I think there's still scams. Like we recently did research about, malware, mobile malware that's spreading around in Europe called Flubot. Look it up. And still, you know, malware uses the ability to send messages and text messages, not necessarily to these types of phone calls. Again, this might be traceable. Also, an interesting thing. Notice that this is in Russian. I hope it's in Russian. But I think it's in Russian. And, you know, for a long time, as I was reading about this, ransomware was considered something that was happening in Russia and sort of moving to the West, which I don't think anybody considers today to be, well, nowadays it's coming from Russia, but it's existing in the West. Back in the day, it was only a problem for them. All right. Spoiler alert. You all know where we're going with this. Bitcoin was the key that unlocked ransomware. This is called CryptoLocker. CryptoLocker was one of the first, if not the first, ransomware. This was 2013, started using Bitcoin. And I think that is really where the ability to ransom people was unlocked. It was all thanks to this man. Lucky 123456. That was his name. He was sort of the ring lord of the Game Over Zeus botnet, and this Mr. Lucky, this businessman, as you can see, he is very successful. All thanks to his ransomware and botnet efforts. This was kind of one of the first collaborations where, Zeus, I don't know if you know, Zeus was a Trojan, was a banking Trojan, and botnet, and then eventually it distributed ransomware, and it distributed this ransomware was the biggest collab of 2013. To the detriment of all of us. But this is also kind of the first, I would say one of the first ways that this business model started to grow of these organized crime groups. It was a very well organized group. They kind of had a lot of slave devices on their botnet, and they were able to encrypt them and take the money. Again, ransomware used to attack just regular people and take, 2 bitcoins, 100, it used to be like $100 or $200. So this is that guy. Actually, they tried to shut his botnet down, Operation Tovar, and, they weren't able to catch him, so he's still somewhere out there with his cat. Okay. Now here's the interesting thing. We talked about the encryption, and I think the encryption is pretty well set. We talked about the business model. I think Bitcoin is not something we're going to solve anytime soon. It's anonymous. It's hard to trace. You can transfer a lot of money there. It's everything that you would want as a cyber criminal. So what about the delivery? And I think this is where things are pretty interesting. So the delivery. This is the interesting thing about delivery that we're going to find out. The delivery mechanism doesn't evolve. It just kind of builds like a layer cake of vulnerabilities. It just grows and grows. Everything old is still relevant today. But I think the sort of the delivery mechanism started with the sneaker net of the old days. The sneaker net, just like the shoe, the sneaker, that's what they used to call it. It's when you take your floppy disk and you walk over to your friend's house and you put it into their computer. It was so ineffective and slow that people didn't believe that viruses existed, right? Like there's all these articles and letters about viruses that they were like a myth, and people talking about them like they didn't exist. But viruses did exist back then, and they were pretty interesting. And there's a lot to kind of read about it, but that was the first delivery method. When you think about it, if you have a problem hacking to an organization, even today, sometimes the easiest way is to put on an IT t-shirt and a USB stick and just to walk into the office and to try and just do it physically. So this is technically still something that might work. But after the 90s, in the late 90s, mid-90s, this is the golden age of shit hitting the fan. We have Windows 95, Office, Flash, all these things just full of bugs, full of holes. And it's what I love about this is, if you've heard of Melissa, the Melissa virus, very famous virus from the old days. Does anybody know what type of virus it was? So actually, I think it was a macro virus. I believe it was defined, even here. It was a macro virus. And that was back in the mid-90s. Does anybody know macros? Macros, that's the brilliant idea that Microsoft had. They were like, okay, you got this Office, you can write on it. What if we give you this ability? You can write commands, you can automate the whole thing. And then it can also write commands to the machine, and they expected everybody to use it legitimately. But actually, this became the most dominant type of virus in sort of the mid-90s, because people would use it to infect things. Well, I guess that was 30 years ago, right? So a lot of things have changed since then. Microsoft Office doesn't run macros automatically. It asks for your permission to run them. A whole lot has changed. But so actually macros are still used all the time for attacks. You get a document, like a Word document in your email address, and if you enable macros, the macro would run a code, and then would run some code like PowerShell or something like that, and it would initiate the attack. So it's good to know that 25 years later, we still haven't solved the problem. Also spam emails. I mean, I guess spam emails, ever since the email was created, you've got spam emails. This is part of, the precursor to phishing emails and exploit kits. So, Flash was sort of the original Swiss cheese, for Switzerland, the Swiss cheese of vulnerabilities. It was full of bugs and would constantly get abused. And it doesn't exist today, but there's still plenty of things that could get abused, when you go online, in the form of exploit kits. Kind of moving forward in time, we'll come back to all these things later. The 2000s, when I was reading about 2000s, there was a lot of like downloading things. This was when all these file sharing, software, Kazaa, and all these were very, very becoming very popular. And you would be downloading your favorite Britney Spears song, and instead it was some virus somebody wrote and would ruin your day. So I guess the lesson here is always buy the music, never steal. But I guess we all did it. So that was kind of a vector that is still relevant today, but I kept reading about this as something that was a threat in the mid-90s, and sort of in the 2000s, but 2010, I think, is where kind of it all came into its own and kind of the focal point. There were a couple of things that came sort of together around that time that are very, very relevant today. So Trojans, in the form of banking Trojans and other Trojans, that was a software that was created to basically infiltrate your computer, try to read your banking credentials, and try to take some of your money, log in and try to take some of your money. These originally were called banking Trojans and aimed at these devices, but eventually developed into more complex things. As if you can get into somebody's computer, you could probably do a lot more. And a good example of that was our friend with the cat, who developed a Trojan called Zeus, or Game Over Zeus. Eventually became Game Over Zeus. Botnets were also a thing that was just kind of coming into its own. And again, the ability to spread, not just through a network, but to spread across the internet, create these slave devices, and then send commands to them, and then do whatever you want with them, was also a very important thing. Because, like I said, it's like a layer cake. All of these things kind of come together when you think about a modern ransomware attack. Because modern ransomware attacks nowadays are kind of created as multi-stage attacks. You might get an email. That email might contain a document. If you run it, and you enable the macros for whatever reason, it would run a code. So our macros from the 90s, and then, whatever worming capabilities you would find in a worm or a botnet or anything like that would then help you move laterally. The Trojan would help you establish persistence and so on. And all of this just kind of comes together. Of course, they're all evolving in their own way from generation to generation, but there's kind of a presence in modern attacks. So that's sort of modern delivery. You spread through the network. You do your best to get to the entire network, and then you deliver your payload, and your payload might be a ransomware. So the delivery is not something that so much evolved as it just compounds, and it will probably continue to compound. Even though, of course, new vulnerabilities are discovered every day, but even when we do research today, vulnerabilities from 5 years ago, 7 years ago, Eternal Blue is still being abused out there. So it's not like you have to have the newest vulnerability to be successful or exploit the newest vulnerability. You just have to exploit the one that nobody's patching against. So that's where I got to with the delivery. That's what I'm thinking about. But I did want to kind of leave you with something a little bit more, I don't know, educational. Probably not. But, let's summarize all of this, right? So from floppy disks in mailboxes, we're now looking at modern attacks, with many, many stages. And with encryption, from symmetric encryption, we see a lot more complicated one. With the business model of cash in the mail, we're finding very complicated businesses now that are working on the other side of the fence with customer service departments and all sorts of weird things. And I think when I think about where we're going to find this moving forward and where we find the most opportunity to disrupt the adversaries or disrupt the attackers is, of course, in the delivery. The delivery is going to continue to evolve, and we're going to continue to try and disrupt them. And so I guess the question is, if I had to leave you with any kind of thought, don't think about ransomware as ransomware. It's not the encryption mechanism that you're defending against most of the time. Although you can try to defend against encryption with some canary files or honeypots, whatever. Think about it, expand it, open it up to the entire attack that it is. Think about what are the places you can impact it. I know I'm not creating a crazy new idea here. But think about where you can stop them, whether it's before they infect, whether it's during, if they're, or during lateral movement, wherever you can try to disrupt them, is where you should put yourself. And that's it. That's my entire story for today. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you for this presentation. We will take a few questions. Please let me know.
Great. We all get 10 minutes back to our day. Well, thank you guys for listening. If you want to come talk to me afterwards, please do. If you have any feedback, let me know. If you have any stories, I would love to hear them as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.